Hi, and welcome to Network Schools, a show dedicated to opening and changing minds about public education. The last two shows we've dedicated to talking about the factory model for schooling. The factory model that is a paradigm that's stuck in people's heads and really is preventing us from, in my judgment, making the changes that we need to make in order to bring public schooling into the 21st century. The first of the two shows talked about why it is that school is 180 days a year, why we follow an agrarian calendar that was put in place in 1900, why school is divided into elementary, junior, and senior high schools, and why schools use seat time as a measure of learning at the high school level. All of these were innovations that were introduced in 1928, the very year that sliced bread was introduced into the public's mind. The second of these two, this four-show sequence, went into greater detail and explained how the factory model leads inevitably to standardized testing as part of the standardization model, which in turn leads to a narrowing of the mission of schools and a narrowing of the curriculum. And that in turn is leading, in my judgment, to an increasing dismay over the quality of public education, because the quality of education currently is being measured almost exclusively by standardized achievement testing. Today, I want to go through a series of slides that talk about transformational technology and are intended to demonstrate how technology is changing education for the better and some of the obstacles to making those changes as well. But in my judgment, the obstacles are less and less insurmountable, and I would argue that we're on the low end of an S curve of change, that in the next 5 to 10 years we're going to see some incredible changes, again, in my judgment, for the good to public schools. Those are being brought about by, I think, three different factors. One factor is there is a wealth of open source information that's out there. Lessons, assessments that teachers can use, all kinds of information that wasn't available even 5, 10 years ago. Secondly, YouTube. When I saw Sal Khan speak earlier this week, he said that when he was first approached about putting his lessons on YouTube, he said, YouTube? Well, that's for cats playing pianos. But the fact of the matter is, YouTube is increasingly a resource that teachers are using to provide lessons asynchronously to students. That is, students can look at them when they want to look at them, not necessarily during the 6 hours a day that they're in the four walls of the school. And it's increasingly being used by colleges and universities. There's a consortium of colleges that includes Stanford, Carnegie Mellon University, MIT, and I believe even Harvard, that are offering online lectures that anybody can look at anytime they want for free. They're not giving credit for these, but the very fact that it's possible now to view these lectures online on your computer when you want to, where you want to, is going to revolutionize instruction. And finally, Facebook or any of the social media provide a mechanism for people to exchange information rapidly and ramp up quickly when they want to introduce change. So those are at least three big forces that 7 years ago, when I was working on a book called Beyond Factory Schools, they weren't there. And it was puzzling to me how it was going to come to pass that we'd be able to move beyond the factory model to what I call a network model of schooling. But now it's very evident that this could happen far more rapidly than I would have imagined. I want to review some of the potential benefits of technology, because quite often people, when they think of technology, they think, oh, we're going to put a kid in a closet, he's going to do some electronic spreadsheets or electronic worksheets, and everything's going to be sort of isolated, and they're you know, this is not the direction that we want to go. It's going to lead to increased isolation, and it's just boring. But that's not the case. That was the way that online learning was 5, 10 years ago. But now it's a different world. And the benefits of technology far outweigh the deficits. Let me walk through these one at a time. One is that the customization of the curriculum, the teaching methods and schedules. It's now absolutely conceivable that you could customize the curriculum to match the students' rate of learning, their style of learning, and any obstacles that they have you could overcome by matching the instruction to the student's needs. So that let's say, for example, that a youngster just isn't getting the algebra the way you're teaching it to him, or a particular algebra unit the way that you're teaching it to him or her. You could go online if you're a teacher and you could find 5, 6, 7 different ways that that same concept is being presented by 5, 6, or 7 different teachers, and have the youngster look at it in that format. And it's not just math that would be that way. It's lots of content is now readily available, and it's going to be increasingly so because there are very inexpensive ways to upload videos online, and if a particular teacher knows of another teacher in the school who could provide the lesson more effectively, it could be delivered that way. I'm working now up in the North Country of New Hampshire, and they struggle because of geographic isolation. And there are a number of rural school districts all over the country who for years have struggled with the fact that they're geographically removed from the mainstream, so to speak. It's really difficult to go out and recruit a physics teacher or foreign language teachers when you're in these rural school districts and small school districts. But now those obstacles are no longer in place because of the opportunity to have online instruction through YouTube, through open source software that's available. At the same time, that small schools or schools that are challenged in terms of their ability to offer expansive courses at the secondary level, those are going to be readily available for everyone. And contrary to what the first thought might be, there will be an increased interaction between teachers and students and classmates. I recommend that you enter Khan TED in your Google box on your computer, and you take a look at the 20-minute video that Khan did as part of a TED Talk, Sal Khan, where he was describing how Khan Academy works. And you'll see there that as a result of monitoring the students' performance on various assessments that are given, formative assessments, over the course of a year, that the teacher can determine quickly where a student is encountering difficulty, and they can interact with that student at a rapid pace. The measure of students per teacher, Khan contends, isn't the important one. It's how much time does the teacher spend with each kid. And if a teacher is spending 20 minutes of 40 minutes giving a lecture or giving an explanation to students, that's 20 minutes that teacher is not spending intervening, remediating, or interacting with a student in the classroom. And so there would be more interaction if there was less large group instruction. I'm not saying that you would eliminate all large group instruction, but boy, you'd take a long, hard look at how much time you're spending disengaged from individual students, because it's that individual student engagement that yields the greatest growth in terms of student learning. There's also the idea that the students could work with each other, because you could flag the students who are doing exceedingly well and pair them with the students who are struggling a little bit. And I know, and anybody else who's been a teacher knows, that you learn more about content when you teach it than when you are a learner. No matter how engaged of a learner you are, when you turn around and try to explain to someone a concept or an idea, you find yourself learning it in a different way and in a deeper way. So the notion of having students working increasingly with their classmates is a positive one. And that would happen more frequently if you were carefully tracking how each student is progressing through the curriculum on an individualized basis. Technology also provides ways for increased parental involvement in schooling. And I know that at the secondary level, most of the school districts in this region have adopted some form of a power school or a method whereby parents can look in real time at how their youngster is doing in each course. And depending on the frequency that the teacher posts grades, they can keep track, perhaps on a daily basis, as to what the students' assignments are and how well they're doing. That kind of technology wasn't available 10 years ago. And if we could begin to engage parents early in the youngster schooling, that is the real challenge that particularly struggling schools face, is finding ways to engage parents in the learning of their youngsters from the get-go. Technology is a means of providing that, and it can be done inexpensively. Finally, and from my perspective, most importantly, technology would provide some more sophisticated means of measuring student performance. The student performance would not be limited to how the youngster is doing once a year on a test that's administered as part of No Child Left Behind. Instead, parents could monitor how their child is doing in a whole host of subject areas and a whole host of content areas based on observing their progress through a carefully thought out sequence of topics that the teacher has developed in accordance with state standards that have been set up. We could get away from these group tests being the sole metric that is used as the basis for student performance and for teacher performance, and instead get into the more subtle ways of measuring performance. There are some limitations. One of the very big limitations is that broadband is not available to all students right now. In fact, it's not even available to all schools right now, but I believe that particularly in Vermont and New Hampshire, that the ARRA-funded projects are going to result in most, if not all, of the schools having the capability of broadband that would enable them to download a lot of this information, video information from the internet. It's a shame that the money that isn't being spent to provide this for everyone, particularly for the outlying schools and school outlying students, and particularly for students who are not particularly affluent. But that's an area that is, I think, not insurmountable. There are some reasons that it would be a good thing from a profit standpoint for broadband to be made more widely available, and that may drive broadband to be made more widely available, even in rural areas. Economic development and high-speed internet connectivity go together. Businesses cannot thrive if they don't have high-speed internet, and where they're looking to develop new businesses across the country and within governmental, cities, counties, towns, they're going to be trying to get broadband made available. The second is that teachers are often slow to adapt to change, and this is not to discredit or demean teachers, but it's really, really difficult for anybody to adapt to the changes that come with the use of technology. especially when it's imposed from the outside. And anecdotally, I've heard, for example, doctors and nurses and health practitioners at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center are struggling because of the changes that are being imposed as a result of the legislation, the healthcare legislation that's occurred. And I know that when we've tried in the school systems that I've worked in to impose from on high new technologies, that there's always some resistance to that. But I can tell you that there's a number of teachers in all the school districts that I'm familiar with, and I'm working with 13 of them up in the North Country, and I've been superintendent of at least 5. They are all have a number of teachers who are very technologically savvy and who are very eager to try these new things, and they're very eager to share what they've learned with their colleagues. And I think that if the change is allowed to occur from the bottom up, that it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen faster than we might believe. The current organization of the schools, which is the factory model, with the existing testing program, is antithetical to individualization. And that's a limitation to the use of technology in the schools. If the expectation is that the youngsters in 3rd grade are all going to be at a certain place at a certain point in time, and they're not there, and as a consequence of them not being there, their teacher might be penalized, their school might be penalized, people are going to continue to teach the test. They're not going to go for the individualization, which would allow for students to not move as quickly as some normative test would want them to believe. And finally, current governance of schools limits the rate of change due to what I call demosclerosis. This is not a term that I invented. It's one that I read, came, I believe, from the mid-90s. But the notion is that because democracy, one of the limits of democracy is that it can't change as rapidly as business can. And that's because there are so many competing interests in public education right now that it's hard to interpose change into an organization, particularly in an environment where you're competing for ever scarce dollars. If the pie, the amount of money that was being spent was expanding, it would be much easier to introduce technology into schools and think that it's not going to result in, oh, well, I either buy computers or I have fewer teachers. I believe that there's a way that you could do both, but right now we need to rely mostly on grant money for this because we're not getting the pie to get any bigger. And the notion, the very fact that high-stakes tests are the be-all and end-all, and there's no evidence that shows that the use of computers is going to move that metric 1 inch on the scale, leads to a degree of skepticism on the part of school boards and school administrators and the public to spend extra money for technology. And as long as the metric that is used to determine whether or not something is a good investment is standardized achievement tests, I'm afraid that we're going to find ourselves stuck where we are now, absent a new infusion of money. So those 3rd and the 4th bullet are sort of intertwined with each other when it comes to limiting technology. Because I think broadband is going to come. I think that teachers from the bottom up are going to begin embracing technology more and more. But boy, oh boy, it's going to be really hard to persuade people that this is the direction to go when but spending is limited. I envision 2 technology scenarios occurring. Technology 1 is, or scenario 1, the one on the left-hand side, is what would happen if public school rejects technology. And by this I it wouldn't be an explicit rejection, it would be a de facto rejection. If state and local boards continue to use grade level test results as the sole basis for measurement, as I just said, there isn't sufficient evidence today that shows that the use of computer technology or any kind of technology changes the results on standardized achievement tests. So as long as that is used as the basis of measurement, that they may find themselves, school boards and states, in the position of rejecting additional spending for technology. As long as teachers are concerned about their own personal and school well-being as it applies to these tests, they're going to teach the test. If a teacher is told that their salary is going to be contingent on how well the kids do on tests, which is one of the things that the Race to the Top is advocating, you can bet your bottom dollar that that test is going to be taught to, because it's going to be an important consideration, perhaps consideration of retaining your job, not only in terms of whether you get a raise or not. And schools, if they're going to be closed down in urban areas because they don't meet the standard, or they're going to have all kinds of adverse consequences occur, they're going to teach you the test too. What would happen in that situation is the parents who get dismayed with the narrow curriculum and become aware of all of these online options, they opt out of school. Because homeschooling is always an option, and I could envision groups of parents banding together, creating their own homeschool alliances, and abandoning public education. In 2003, I was visiting my stepdaughter in Calaveras County, California, and her roommate at the time, the roommate at the time's mother was running a hybrid homeschool, which I described in an article that I got published in Education Week. It was called The Network School. That's what the name of the article was, which is where the title of this show comes from. And in that school, which was not really a school like we think of it, the youngsters were at the time doing online learning at home, and it was old school online learning. It wasn't anything video. It was doing electronic spreadsheets. And then they would come to school 2 or 3 times a week, and during the time that they were in school, they would have group interaction kinds of things. There were, as I recall, because I haven't looked at the article recently, something like 250 kids in the school. It was a K-12 school, not unlike some of the schools that I'm working with up in the North Country. And the parents were doing most of the education at home, but when the kids got together, the teachers worked on teaching them things like group skills and intervening where the kids were struggling. I could see schools like that popping up all over the place. If parents get frustrated with the narrow curriculum offerings that schools are offering, and they want to do something new and different, it's easy to do given the guidelines for homeschooling now. The other scenario is that the public school embraces technology, and instead of using these standardized achievement tests that we're using now to measure school effectiveness, they use some kind of mastery test results as the basis for measurement. Kahn, in his presentation that he gave at Dartmouth College in late April, was suggesting the notion that students would get merit badges for the demonstrations that they have mastered a certain level of proficiency. And in fact, we already have a model for that. I think that if they switch the camera over, this is a model here of the kind of mastery test that could be administered to students. This is my driver's license. Now, I was fortunate the first time that I went to get my driver's license. I passed the written test with no problems, and I passed the performance test, which is the driving part of the test, the first time around. Now, I know I didn't get a perfect score on the written test, And as I recall, I probably might have hit the wheel on the curb when I was doing the parallel parking. So it wasn't perfect. But it met the standard that was set in both cases. Now, my daughter, who isn't nearly as good at driving as I am, had to do the performance test twice. But she got the same kind of driver's license as I did. And I know of some students who I taught or worked with when I was a high school principal who had to take the written test 3 times. But they got the same same license when I got all done. That's an example of a mastery test that everybody's familiar with. And those are the kind of mastery tests that we ought to use as a metric for whether or not students are learning in school. Because in order to get that driver's license, I had to meet a standard that had been set externally that everybody agreed was the standard. If I didn't meet the standard, I didn't get the license. So what we need to do, in my judgment, is define a series of mastery tests and then use as a basis for whether a school is doing well or a teacher is doing well, how many students are attaining mastery level on those tests over time. And it's going to take every student a different amount of time to pass this test, the driver's test. But eventually, everybody who wants to learn how to drive gets the driver's license one way or the other. The other thing that would happen if public schools embrace technology is that the teachers would adopt some form of technology-driven individualization. And as a result of doing that, they'd be able to expand or restore the breadth of instruction. They could expand it if it's been narrowed. They could, or restore it if it's been narrowed, or they could expand it right now beyond what we're doing in schools, because we're not doing everything in schools that we could. If this were to happen, parents who would see the benefits of individualization would remain committed to public education, and I think the public would open their eyes and see that, yes, the students who are leaving school are meeting a standard analogous to the driver's license standard. The chart that you see in front of you is an example of what's called in business literature an S-curve. The book came out several years ago, well, I guess it was only 2 years ago, by Clay Christensen and Michael Horn about disruptive technology. And in that, they suggest that the S-curve happens frequently in technology disruption. This is an example of an S-curve with a cell phone. You probably can't see it, but in 1996, there were fewer than 10 million people using cell phones. And in 97, it was still under 10 million. In 98, it moved up to about 12 million. And then in 99, it doubled to 22 million. And then it nearly doubled again in 2000. And then over the succeeding years, the number of new cell phones that were added to the list increased until there were 65 million in place. We've had several S-curves in our lifetimes, and I'm speaking maybe for my lifetime. I can remember vacuum tubes. They were replaced by transistor technology, and one of the articles that I assigned to my class in Iliad showed that that was an S-curve. Foreign cars displacing the big three. ATMs replacing bank tellers. I can recall back when I was in high school that FM radio really didn't exist. But that expanded exponentially as well, leading to what we now have today, which is narrowcasting, where there's like a specialty FM radio station for every musical taste known to man. Pay cable TV has done the same thing, displacing 3 networks with 500. Video rentals displaced movies on TV. No longer did you have Saturday Night at the Movies as one of the shows you could watch. You didn't need to watch it anymore. You could get your own video and watch whatever you wanted. And now video rentals are going out of business quickly because you can open up your laptop and watch video at home. It's my contention that the next S-curve is going to be online, on-demand video instruction. That S-curve is, we're now at the low end of that S-curve, but it's rapidly multiplying, doubling, and on just about an annual basis. As I mentioned in an earlier broadcast, in the last 18 months, 41 million people have viewed a Khan Academy video. The number of videos that Khan has multiplied similarly, and it's only going to get bigger because teachers will get on social media, they'll begin developing their own videos, and as they share the videos with each other, the number of students who are using those videos is also going to expand. My only hope is that as it expands, we find ourselves embracing the technology and not rejecting the technology. I look forward to the next show when I'll have a chance to walk through a comparison between the factory school that we've had in the past and the network school that I envision us having in the future. Hope you'll be watching then, and I hope this has been informative for you. Thanks very much.